She placed the plate in front of me and said, with a cold smile I'll never forget, "This is what you deserve." It was hard rice, meat with a strange odor, and a greenish sauce that said it all without words. I looked at that plate, then at her, my daughter-in-law, and understood that this wasn't carelessness. It was revenge. It was contempt. And worst of all, my son was across the table, motionless, without saying a word, as if he agreed with everything. I ate in silence, because it was either that or starve. But she didn't know what I would do with that plate. She never imagined that this gesture, so small in her eyes, would become the trigger for a story that would change everything. That night, I spent hours in the bathroom. I vomited until I felt like my body was turning inside out. I felt a chill run through me as if life was slowly leaving me. The light was dim, the house silent, and no one knocked on the door to ask if I was okay. I trembled, not just from weakness, but from revolt. It was there, kneeling on the cold floor of that bathroom, that I promised myself, this won't end like this. They won't erase me like a disposable burden. I discovered what was on that plate, and the truth shocked even those who thought they'd seen it all. But before I tell you how it all turned out, let me warn you, this story is real. It's mine. And if you've ever been ignored, humiliated, or treated like a nuisance simply for existing, you need to hear this through to the end. So subscribe to the channel and comment where you watch from, because what I'm about to reveal now is more than a story. It's a warning. My daughter-in-law has always been subtle in her wickedness. The kind who smiles in front of others, but slowly poisons, in her gaze, in her cutting words, in the small actions that no one notices, until it's too late. After my husband died, I moved in with my son, Brian, thinking I'd find some comfort, that I could care for my grandchildren and be useful. But what I found was a home that saw me as a burden, as a leftover. My presence bothered, even when I was quiet, washing dishes or folding other people's clothes. Samantha, my son's wife, never liked me. She always made it clear with her jokes, with the dishes she served just for me. Different from the others, always colder, always scarcer. I pretended not to notice. Out of love for my son. Out of fear of creating conflict. But that day, everything changed. The sentence, the dish, the expression on her face. It was a turning point. Because right then, she stopped hiding it. Brian said nothing. He didn't defend me. He didn't look me in the eye. I think my pain is invisible to him. As if my age means I no longer have any right to his respect. As if everything I did for him, every sleepless night, every patched-up outfit, had simply evaporated from memory. But what no one expected was what I would do in silence. That I would put that plate away. That I would take that leftover and take it for analysis. And the result? The result knocked all the masks off. But before that, there was still the cold of dawn. The frozen ground. The bitter taste of humiliation. And it was there, right there, that something inside me woke up. I've never been the kind of woman to complain about life. I've always believed that silence is also a form of wisdom. My name is Beatrice, I'm 72 years old, and although many people see me today as just another elderly lady, what I carry within me is a whole story of struggle, love, and sacrifice. Before all this happened, before that dish, before that night, my life was made up of routine, care, and a certain kind of hope that, even though small, still shone within me. I was a seamstress for almost 4 decades. My hands, which now tremble when I try to pick up a cup, were once steady enough to embroider wedding dresses and mend workers' uniforms. I raised my son alone for many years, while my husband faced health problems. When he passed away, after battling cancer for so long, I felt like a part of me had gone with him. It was like losing my footing. But that same week, Brian looked at me and said, "Come live with us, Mom. You don't have to go through this alone." And I did. I thought I would be welcome. I thought I could start over, even in my old age. At first, I tried to fit in. I woke up early, made breakfast the old-fashioned way, with toast, scrambled eggs, and strong coffee. Samantha never liked anything. She complained that the smell lingered in the house, that I used too much salt, that everything was a mess. So I started taking care of the kids. Folding the grandchildren's clothes, organizing their backpacks, packing their snacks. I thought that if I didn't make myself useful, I'd just be a burden. And being a burden to someone you love is one of the hardest feelings there is. Over time, I realized the space in the house was getting smaller for me. First, they stopped inviting me to dinner with them. Then, the television that had been in the living room moved to the children's room. After that, came the back and forth messages, the indirect remarks. I pretended not to hear. Because the truth is, for a woman like me, with a life dedicated to others, admitting that she's being discarded hurts more than any illness. But even pretending, I felt it. Every silence. Every closed door. Every forced smile at breakfast. My routine became a kind of backstage area for their lives. I was the invisible presence that kept everything running, but nobody saw. I washed, cooked, and mended holy socks without being asked. I'd sit on the porch in the afternoons, soaking up some sun and pretending to be fine, just so as not to disturb them. Sometimes I'd spend hours waiting for someone to come home just to hear a human voice. In those moments, I remembered the Beatrice of old. The one who had clients, who went out with her friends from church, who laughed out loud at the end of the day. And I'd wonder where I'd gotten lost. The pain didn't start with that plate. It was just the symbol of everything that had already been silently piling up. The ruined plate was just the trigger. Because the truth is, humiliation begins long before the direct offense. It begins with indifference. In the absence of a good morning, a thank you, a sincere look. It begins when someone decides you no longer matter. And the cruelest thing about it all is that you start to believe it too. But something inside me still resisted. It wasn't pride. It was memory. It was dignity. I remembered who I was, what I'd built, how hard I'd fought to keep that family alive. And I began to understand that if I did nothing, the rest of my life would be an empty echo inside other people's homes. So I started paying attention to the details. The way she watched me as she served the food. The smell, the texture. I started writing down dates, storing leftovers in jars, listening behind doors when they thought I was sleeping. What looked like a frail old woman waiting for death to arrive was, in fact, a woman making calculations, connecting clues, preparing the groundwork. And that's why that morning, after spending the night embracing pain, I got up with shaky legs but firm resolve. I wrapped the plate in aluminum foil, put it in a bag, and went to my neighbor. She was a retired nurse. She looked at me and understood instantly that it wasn't just spoiled food. It was something else. She made some connections. And so began the path that would lead me to the hidden truth behind that dinner. A truth that, when it came to light, shattered the entire image of normalcy that house still tried to maintain. From the moment I began to suspect that there was more to that dish than just spoiled food, things began to make more sense. It was as if a light had suddenly turned on in a room where I'd been groping in the dark for months. Details I'd previously ignored now screamed out. And what had previously seemed like rudeness or impatience began to reveal its true form. It was contempt, disguised as routine. It was rejection, hidden between the lines of a no need to bother. Samantha didn't insult me directly. She did better, or worse. She would nullify me with small gestures that went unnoticed by any visitors or even Brian himself, who preferred not to see what was right in front of him. If someone asked me to sit in the living room, she would quickly remind me that the boys needed space. If I offered to help in the kitchen, she would say with a smile, "You've done enough in your life. Now it's time to rest." And then she would whisper something to my son, looking sideways, as if relishing the manipulation. It started with the dishes. Theirs always arrived fresh, decorated, steaming. Mine, reused, lukewarm, sometimes even with a fly already on it. I pretended not to notice. Or maybe I pretended it was normal, that it wasn't intentional. But it eats away at you. Not because of the food itself, but because of the meaning. It's as if each dish were a sentence. A silent reminder that, in that house, I was no longer welcome. I was tolerated. Then came the whispers. I'd walk down the hallway and hear my name punctuated by muffled laughter. Once, I went into the children's room to fold some clothes and heard the oldest say, "Mommy said Grandma is weird." I froze. I had to leave before they saw my face. And I cried in the bathroom, silently, like so many other times. Because what hurt me wasn't what they said. It was what they were teaching. The image they were planting of me in my grandchildren's heads. The doors began to close more frequently. Sometimes slammed shut. Sometimes locked. I'd stay in the kitchen, listening to the commotion, the family dinners happening without me, the conversations that once included me now being cut off when I arrived. And Brian. Oh, Brian. My son had always been quiet, but with me, he had a different tone. He was affectionate. He was careful. Or at least he was. These days, he simply agreed with whatever Samantha decided. He'd answer me with a, "I'll be right back," that never came true. He listened to me with the patience of someone waiting for a phone call to end. There was one day in particular that really stuck with me. I was washing the dishes, standing for almost an hour, when I heard Samantha whisper, "She drags herself around the house like dead weight. And he still thinks he has to." And then, laughter. Quick, restrained, but loud enough to break me inside. I leaned against the sink, my legs weakening. But I didn't cry. Not then. The pain was turning into something else inside me. A kind of bitter strength. A desire to show that, even with age, with apparent fragility, I could still recognize a hidden cruelty. The hidden truth behind that interaction was uglier than any explicit fight scene. It was a calculated rejection. A humiliation designed to leave no trace. Because there was no shouting, no shoving. There was only the constant reminder that I was no longer useful. And that, there, I was occupying a space they preferred to see empty. All of this messed with my mind. I began to see that house as a stage. A perfectly constructed set to hide what was going on behind the scenes. A sham family, where everyone knew their role. Except me, who was slowly being relegated to the role of an extra. But I still had something they seemed to have lost. Awareness. I saw it. I felt it. And, most importantly, I remembered. I remembered what I'd faced, what I'd sacrificed, the sleepless nights, the decisions I'd made so that my son would grow up with dignity. And now, his silence hurt more than her words. Even so, I didn't show anything. I continued to fulfill my role. But inside, everything was changing. It was as if I were walking on broken pieces. With each step, a new pain, but also a new certainty that I couldn't go on like this. I knew that, to survive this situation emotionally, I would need to transform all of this into movement. Into action. Into something that showed I still existed. And that's exactly what I began to do. Not as revenge. At least not at first. But as a response. As a way to reclaim what no one there seemed to see in me anymore. My story, my strength, my voice. And while they continued to laugh behind my back, whispering behind closed doors, I had already begun a path that would soon bring each of them face to face with the consequences of what they were trying to hide. That night, the smell of food seemed different to me. I was sitting at the table, as usual, with the plate served in front of me. It was always the last one to be placed, always with less care, always with the dregs of what was left from the pans. But on this particular night, there was something else. Something sour, sickening, that rose in my nose before I even took the first bite. I hesitated, but I ate. Not because I was hungry. I ate for fear of rejection and hearing another comment disguised as kindness, another joke contained in a look, another subtle gesture that only the victim notices. The next few hours were a kind of silent punishment. I felt my stomach churn with a suddenness that frightened me. I started with mild nausea, but soon came pain, dizziness, and a cold sweat. I dragged myself to the bathroom, my hands clutching my stomach as if I could contain the chaos spreading inside. I vomited so much I lost count. And as my body trembled and my vision blurred, all that came to mind were old scenes I thought were already buried. Memory has a strange way of surfacing when we're weak. I remembered when Brian was little. The nights I'd go to bed hungry just to leave him more food. The time I'd mend the same shoe 3 times because I couldn't afford a new one. I remembered the cold nights I'd cover him with my own coat, praying for the fever to pass. All of this washed over me there, kneeling on the floor, my body rejecting the contaminated food. And it was in that instant that I understood what was happening. This wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. That food had been prepared with carelessness, perhaps with something more. I staggered back to my room. No one came to help me. No one knocked on the door. No one asked if I needed a glass of water. I huddled in bed with a thin blanket, my body cold, my muscles aching. And in the silence of the early morning, I heard laughter. On the other side of the wall, in Brian and Samantha's room. They were laughing, talking, living as if nothing had happened. That laughter was like a blow. A cruel reminder that my pain no longer had a place in their reality. I was a nuisance, a shadow, and they, frankly, seemed content with that. The worst part wasn't the physical pain. It was realizing that, even in a moment of extreme fragility, there wasn't a single gesture of care. That the woman who once married my son had become someone capable of ignoring, or worse, causing, the suffering of another person, especially the one who once held that home together with her own hands. And that my son, the same one who called me my warrior when I was a child, was now part of the silence that suffocated me. I cried, but it was no longer the cry of someone hoping for comfort. It was the cry of someone waking up. Of someone realizing they've hit rock bottom. And rock bottom isn't pain, it's oblivion. It's feeling that your existence has lost its impact, that your presence has lost its value, that your name within the house you helped build has become a nuisance everyone prefers to avoid. But something inside me, even there, lying in the darkness, still screamed. A small but firm voice. A voice that said, "You are still you." A woman who has survived widowhood, poverty, sleepless nights, and loss. A woman who knows the weight of every renunciation, and who would not accept being erased like this, without exposing at least one truth. The next morning, still weak and hands trembling, I got up slowly. I grabbed the plate I'd stashed in the back of the refrigerator. It was wrapped in aluminum foil, like a piece of evidence, a key piece to something much larger. I didn't know exactly what I'd find, but I knew what I felt. And that feeling didn't lie. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. And this revelation, painful as it was, needed to come out of the darkness. I decided I would take that plate for analysis. It wasn't easy to find someone who would take me seriously. Most people look at an elderly woman as if her mind were already clouded, as if our words were daydreams. But I found someone who listened. A neighbor, a retired nurse, with a watchful eye and a heart that could still recognize genuine suffering. She saw my condition, heard my words, and never wavered. Together, we made the decision. It was time to act. Not to cause a scandal. Not for pure revenge. But for something deeper. For truth. For dignity. For all the women like me who live similar stories, hidden behind closed windows and forced smiles. And for all those who, like me, were forced to swallow not only spoiled food, but also bitter words and piercing silences. That marked the beginning of a silent transformation. A journey that would require more than courage. It would require rescue. The rescue of my history, my strength, my identity. And as the city began to wake up outside, I walked toward something that, until then, had seemed impossible. Being heard again. The morning I felt strong enough to get out of bed. The sun barely pierced the thin kitchen curtain. The silence in the house was the same as always. Not the peaceful silence, but the silence that hides, that suffocates, that doesn't want to be interrupted. I walked slowly, my legs still shaky, and went to the sink. There were dirty dishes, a frying pan with traces of grease, the garbage from the night before still overflowing. Samantha always said there was no time to take it out. But I knew it was intentional. Everything was. As I wiped the counter, my eyes fell on a nearly invisible detail, a crumpled package, lying in the corner of the trash, label side down. I picked it up carefully. It was a sauce, the same one used on the steak she'd served me. The expiration date? Expired months ago. My fingers trembled. Not with anger, but with a confirmation I didn't want to have. It couldn't just be negligence. There was a hidden intention in that gesture. And it was this kind of silent malice that frightened me the most. The kind that's expressed with a smile, like someone just taking care of the house. I held the sauce up to the window light and took a closer look. The texture was strange. The smell sour even with the lid closed. And that's when I decided to look deeper. I calmly opened the refrigerator and took out the container where I'd stored the leftovers from dinner. It was there, wrapped in foil, just as I'd left it. The rice had hardened, the meat had shrunk, the sauce had curdled. This was more than food now. It was proof. Proof of a hidden truth that, until then, had existed only in my intuition. But now it was there, before my eyes, before my hands, and I had to do something with it. The most curious thing was Samantha's expression when she saw me messing around in the kitchen that day. She stopped in the doorway, a cup of coffee in her hand, and drawled, "Did you sleep well?" It was like a slap. A mockery. She knew. And the lightness in the way she looked at me, as if in control, confirmed everything I'd already been feeling. But I responded with a calm smile, as if nothing was out of place. Because in that moment, I realized that this would be my greatest weapon. Strategic silence. There was no point in confronting her immediately. The impact needed to be deeper. I wanted more than just proving her wrong. I wanted to expose it in a way no one could pretend anymore. That no one, not even Brian, could ignore. This journey, which began with a poisoned dish of contempt, now demanded a response that was worthy of it. And I was willing to follow it through, even alone. Because, at that point, it wasn't just for me anymore. It was for everything I represented, for all the women who had endured this in silence, for all those who, like me, had been made invisible within their own homes. My neighbor, the retired nurse, was shocked to see what I'd taken. She carefully analyzed the contents, made a few calls, and consulted a friend of hers who worked at a private laboratory in the city. I had no money, but she said, "This is serious, and no one will pay to see what could have happened to you." Her words restored something I hadn't felt in a long time: value. It was as if, there in that small borrowed kitchen, I had become a person again. Someone deserving of attention, care, and respect. The process wasn't quick. I had to answer questions, share details, sign documents. And with each step, the emotional toll only grew. It wasn't easy to relive everything. To speak out loud about what they did to me, about what they allowed to happen. But it was necessary. Because remaining silent, at that moment, would have been like validating everything. And I couldn't live in silence any longer. I'd done it for too long. As I waited for the results, I found myself remembering myself in other times. Of the parties where I happily prepared food for 20 people, of the afternoons sewing dresses for my nieces, of the hugs Brian gave me when he came home from school. And I wondered when that version of myself had ceased to exist in their eyes. What turns a mother into a nuisance? A threat? The answer perhaps lies in the way people lose the ability to recognize the sacrifices of others. As if time, age, fatigue, render our history irrelevant. But I knew that that dish, that expired sauce, and all the details that had been piling up were part of something bigger. They were the backstage of a truth that, until then, only I could see. And even though no one was looking, I kept putting the pieces together, as if knowing that, sooner or later, everything would come to light. In those days, something inside me was changing. It wasn't just indignation. It was a kind of internal transformation. I was no longer waiting for fixes. No longer seeking approval. And starting to act. Choosing consciously. Deciding for myself. For the first time in a long time, I felt I held in my hands not just a mysterious object, but the thread of a story that needed to be told. And I was ready for the impact it would have when it was finally revealed. The following days were spent waiting, but not the kind of light waiting filled with coffee and patience. It was the kind of waiting that consumes you from within, like a burning ember under your skin. The neighbor, always attentive, called the lab from time to time to check on the progress of the test. Deep down, I already knew. My body had warned me, my intuition had screamed, and Samantha's cynical look that morning had confirmed everything without words. But even so, receiving it on paper, from someone technical, professional, outside the story, would change everything. That was what separated doubt from revelation. That afternoon, when the phone finally rang and she answered in front of me, I could see in her eyes that the answer had arrived. She didn't need to say anything right away. Her face closed, her eyebrows lowered, and her lips pressed together in a gesture of silent indignation. It was only after a few seconds of silence, her eyes still fixed on the floor, that she blurted out, her voice breaking. The report confirmed it. The dish was contaminated. And it wasn't an accident. I closed my eyes. Not out of relief, but out of respect for the pain I'd been trying to suppress. So many times I'd questioned whether I was overreacting, whether I was imagining too much, whether it was just my tired mind misinterpreting other people's behavior. But no. This was now a fact. The food I'd been served was unfit for consumption. And more than that, it contained levels of substances that indicated manipulation. Someone had prepared it intentionally. And what shocked me wasn't just the report's content. It was the coldness with which it had all been orchestrated. In the technical document, the expert described that the meat showed clear signs of advanced deterioration, that the sauce used contained harmful agents incompatible with home preservation, and that the risk of serious poisoning was high. Serious. That was the word that kept echoing in my head. It could have been worse. This could have resulted in hospitalization. You could have taken me away. It could have been the end of my story, ending with the bitter taste of a dish I ate in silence out of respect for a family that no longer saw me as part of it. My neighbor, trying to control her anger, looked at me and said, "This, Mrs. Beatrice, this could have killed you." And there, in that moment, there was no turning back. No fake smile, no soft justification, no sentimental argument would be able to cover it up. The truth was documented, signed, recorded. For the first time in a long time, I felt something outside of myself defending me. That reality had finally proven me neither crazy nor weak nor dramatic. I had been right. All along. And with this truth in my hands, a new dimension opened up before me. I wasn't just a victim. I was the only one with access to the truth. The only one brave enough to face the behind the scenes of what was being staged in that house. The only one who knew exactly how far it could have gone. And worse still, who knew they would have continued behaving the same way if I hadn't done anything. The impact of the outcome was silent but profound. I spent the night with the envelope on my desk, staring at that paper like someone staring at a piece of evidence in an invisible courtroom. I didn't cry. I didn't feel anger. I felt a kind of mature sadness, the kind that comes with lucidity. I realized that what hurt me now was no longer their intention, but the realization that if I had died that night, they would probably say it was due to age, some weakness, something natural. And they would go on with their lives as normal, perhaps even with relief. From that moment on, there was no longer any way to ignore what needed to be done. That discovery demanded a decision. And decisions have consequences. I knew that by bringing this revelation to light, I would open wounds, shatter facades, and perhaps even lose what little connection I had left with Brian. But something inside me told me that doing nothing would be even worse. That silence would be complicity. That inaction would be a second death. It was still too early to plan any definitive action. But one certainty had already firmly established itself within me. I would no longer be the silent woman who accepted everything for fear of rejection. I was now a woman who had survived the attempt to erase herself. And with that truth in my hand, I also held the key to a turning point that was yet to come. The day I decided to show Brian the report, I woke before sunrise. The house was still asleep, plunged into that comfortable silence only for those with a clear conscience. I put on my best blouse, the blue one with small embroidery I'd made years ago and almost never wore because it was too pretty to wear at home. I put on a light lipstick, just to remind myself of myself. And before leaving the room, I looked in the mirror and said quietly, "You're not what they tried to make you out to be." I knew the conversation ahead wouldn't be simple, but there was no more room for hesitation. It was time to turn the tables. I waited for Brian to wake up. He came downstairs, his phone already in hand, distracted, as if it were just another ordinary day. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the envelope on the wooden tabletop, in plain sight. He noticed. He stopped. He frowned. "What's this, Mom?" The way he asked made me realize he felt, even without knowing it yet, that envelope carried a weight he could no longer ignore. I took a deep breath. I spoke calmly. I handed over the document. And there, for the first time in a long time, I saw his gaze change. It went from discomfort to astonishment, from astonishment to discomfort. When he finished reading, he stared at me in silence. A silence that screamed. A silence filled with questions he didn't have the courage to ask aloud. I could sense that, in that moment, he was rethinking every gesture, every response, every time he left me alone or pretended not to notice what was happening under his own roof. He began, but didn't finish. He lowered his eyes. He tried to justify himself, perhaps reflexively. But I interrupted. For the first time in a long time, I spoke without hesitation. And it wasn't a shout, nor an accusation. It was the naked truth. "She served me food that could have killed me, Brian. And you let me." He tried to say something, but I continued. Firm, without anger, but with all the accumulated strength of someone who spent too long being ignored. "I'm not a nuisance. I'm the root of this family. And you know it." The words came out with a clarity that even surprised me, as if they'd been stored away for years, waiting for the right moment to be released. His reaction was a mix of shame and fear. I don't know if it was because of what he'd discovered, or because he'd finally had to face reality. But then, I understood that power was returning to me. Not because of the report, but because, for the first time, I was no longer trying to please or be accepted. I was simply being true to myself. And that changed everything. That same week, I scheduled an appointment with a lawyer specializing in elder rights. My neighbor recommended me, and she welcomed me as if she already knew my story, as if she'd heard many like mine. She shared similar stories, guided me carefully and firmly, and showed me that what happened to me wasn't just a family matter. It was a violation. A real risk. A serious matter. I also sought psychological help. Not because I felt weak, but because I understood that taking care of my mind was part of the recovery process. I needed to rebuild my self-esteem, reclaim my identity, and relearn how to set boundaries. I went to my first session with a heavy heart, but I left feeling that, for the first time in a long time, someone was listening to me without judgment, without rushing, without minimizing my pain. This journey of recovery was slow but transformative. I began writing letters to myself, remembering who I was before all this. I started sewing again, not out of obligation, but for pleasure. Stitch by stitch, I rediscovered pieces of myself that had been erased in the daily life of that house. I bought a new notebook and wrote on the first page, "Here begins the rest of my life." And this time, it will have my name on every line. I began to emotionally distance myself from that environment. I would wake up and go for walks. I would visit old friends. I returned to church, where I was greeted with hugs that reminded me of what it was like to be truly seen. Little by little, I filled the space that loneliness had occupied for so long. And each step was a reminder that I was still alive. That my story hadn't ended that night in the bathroom. Quite the contrary. It was beginning anew. Brian and Samantha didn't notice the change right away. They still thought I was just going through a phase. But the difference was clear. My tone of voice changed. My eyes changed. The way I looked at myself in the mirror changed. And this transformation began to impact the dynamics within the house. They felt it. The tables had turned. And as much as they tried to maintain control, the silence that suffocated me was now theirs. The changes began like small cracks in a wall that, until then, had seemed unshakable. Samantha still tried to maintain her composure, her control, her routine meticulously constructed around her own ego. But something about her no longer fit. Her once sharp gaze now seemed to shift, as if afraid to look in the mirror. Her tone of voice, always too firm, began to waver. It wasn't guilt. It was fear of losing what she thought she had mastered. The silence I maintained in the following days spoke louder than any argument. And this silence, this time, was mine by choice, and by strategy. The neighborhood, which had always been discreet, also began to stir. Nothing too direct, because that's how things happen in this kind of environment. In the details. In the looks that lingered too long, the smiles that didn't return, the doors that no longer opened for her as often. Subtle comments began to circulate, ones that no one admits to having initiated, but that, suddenly, everyone seemed to already know. People who had previously praised her for the tidiness of her home now avoided mentioning her name. Brian's friends began to greet her with a certain hesitation. Small breaches of reputation that, combined, formed a slow but irreversible decline. She tried to fight back discreetly, of course. She started posting family photos as if everything was fine, as if the environment were harmonious and welcoming. She made a point of including me in the images, sometimes even asking me to smile. I smiled. But anyone watching from the outside could never have imagined the weight of those frozen expressions. What she didn't understand was that the damage had already been done. And, more than that, that now she was no longer the one controlling the narrative. Because the truth, even when silent, has a power that no manipulated image can erase. Brian, on the other hand, began to act differently. It wasn't yet a full apology, nor a direct acknowledgement of the pain he'd caused. But it was something. He started coming home early from work, offering to help with chores, and seeking out connections with random phrases in the hallway, as if slowly trying to find a way back. One day he brought me flowers, for no reason, no date, no explanation. He simply said, "I saw you and thought of you." I said nothing, just thanked him. But that gesture, small, almost shy, had an impact. It was the first visible sign that he was beginning to understand, albeit slowly, the depth of the wound he'd allowed to grow under his own roof. The lawyer advised me not to make impulsive decisions. She said that when justice begins to move, haste can be an enemy in disguise. And I understood the message. The transformation I was experiencing didn't need to be rushed. It wasn't about quick revenge. It was about conscience. About reclaiming my place with dignity. And about allowing the truth, now revealed, to do its work. One Sunday, I went to the market alone. It was a simple thing, part of my routine for years, but I'd neglected it because of everything that had happened. I was walking among the stalls when I met Donna Ruth, one of my oldest neighbors. She looked at me, stopped, took my hand, and said, "You're stronger than you think. And now everyone knows it." That struck me. Because, for the first time in a long time, I felt I wasn't alone on that journey. That my pain, exposed and validated, had also become a lesson for others. From then on, Samantha's decline became increasingly evident. She no longer smiled as much. She avoided going out during the times she usually spent with her children. She began letting Brian take care of the house more, something he'd never done before. It was as if the pedestal she'd placed herself on for years was slowly crumbling, and she no longer had the strength to hold it up. The children, once so close to her, began to seek my presence more. Perhaps they sensed something in the air. Children sense. In silence, I began to reclaim my space. Not by imposition, but because what is true finds its place. I started cooking again, but now by choice. With each pot on the stove, with each aroma that filled the house, I felt like I was reclaiming a part of myself. And when one day I heard Brian say to Samantha, in a brief conversation I had the misfortune, or the good fortune, to overhear, "She did for us what no one else would. You need to learn to respect that." I realized that justice doesn't happen only in the legal sphere. It begins in people's hearts. When they realize the impact of their actions, when they understand that wounds left in silence don't mean automatic forgiveness. Yes, I was no longer invisible in that house. But more than that, I was no longer dependent on it. My mindset had changed. My view of myself, too. I was no longer the woman who walked around with her eyes downcast, avoiding conflict, accepting the bare minimum. I had journeyed back within. And there, I rediscovered a strength that had never ceased to exist. It had only been stifled by years of misinterpreted selflessness. And that's why, even with the silent chaos that was taking hold of Samantha, I didn't feel hate. I felt, instead, a kind of firm compassion. The knowledge that what you sow, you reap. And she was reaping. Alone. Without me having to lift another finger. Because life, in some way that only it understands, has a strange way of giving back to us what we give to the world. The day everything aligned for that confrontation arrived without warning. Like things we don't plan but feel they need to happen. I was sitting in the backyard, where almost no one in the house usually goes. It was the only place I could still breathe deeply without being interrupted, where the rustling of leaves and the smell of earth brought back some good memory of myself. Samantha appeared suddenly, looking impatient, a glass of juice in her hand. She made to hand it to me, as if following social protocol, but there was something in her expression that made it clear that gesture wasn't genuine. It was an attempt to erase the evidence under the guise of kindness. She held out the glass, but said nothing. She didn't apologize, didn't joke. She just waited. It was in that charged silence that I decided. I stood up slowly, firmly, and looked into her eyes. Those eyes that had avoided mine for so long. And for a few seconds, I let the silence between us stretch, as if the air around us were about to split in half. Then I said it. I didn't scream, I didn't tremble, I didn't cry. I said it like someone closing a book after reading it to the last page. You gave me poison. I return it with dignity. But you will never serve me again. She froze. I hadn't expected it. I was used to my quiet, withdrawn, fragile self. I didn't know what to do with someone who stood up after being pushed to the ground so many times. And what dismantled her most wasn't what I said, but what was implied. It wasn't just a message. It was a decision. A change in attitude. And, above all, a boundary. She tried to react, searching for some defense on her face, some phrase that would free her from that exposure, but found none. I held her gaze, didn't look away. For the first time, she saw in me not the lady who cares for her grandchildren, nor the bothersome mother-in-law, but a complete woman. With a past, with values, with strength. A woman who survived everything and still chose dignity, when the whole world expected scandal. That scene left its mark. She recoiled. Literally. She took 2 steps back, as if the words had pushed her. There was no scandal, no audience, but there was the true rupture. Not just between the two of us, but between what she thought she controlled and what I finally assumed. And that kind of rupture doesn't require shouting. One sentence is enough. A firm look. A silence that comes after years of submission. That was the impact of the truth coming through the front door. In the days that followed, her presence around the house diminished. There was no longer the same authority in her gestures, the same certainty in her orders. I observed carefully, but without any desire for revenge. What I sought now was not justice in the usual format, but a kind of rebalancing. And it was happening little by little. The atmosphere in the house was no longer the same. Brian treated me with an almost ceremonial care, as if he were trying to start over, even without knowing where. And the children, they began to approach naturally, as if they now felt they could. That week, I started sleeping better. It was as if my body understood that, for the first time in a long time, I was safe. Not by the walls, not by people, but by myself. By the new mindset I had cultivated. By the awareness that living fully, even in the midst of an emotional storm, is possible when you know your own worth. I began to reorganize my things. Not because I planned to leave immediately, but because I wanted to reconnect with my history. I sorted through old photos, letters I'd written over the years but never sent, scraps of fabric saved from the days when sewing was more than work, it was expression. In each object, I rediscovered fragments of the woman I once was. And these fragments, now, no longer hurt. They strengthened me. And it was in this process of reconnection that I understood. My journey wasn't just about resistance. It was about transformation. About how, even in the most hostile environment, it's possible to flourish. I no longer needed Samantha's recognition, nor Brian's blind approval. What I needed, and now had, was clarity. Clarity about what I represented, the impact my presence had, and how my decisions changed the course of things, even in silence. I didn't know what would come next, nor what our lives would be like from now on. But I knew, with all the certainty that maturity brings, that something irreversible had happened within me. And that, from now on, every attempt to silence myself would be met with something new, firm, and unshakable. After everything that happened, every swallowed silence and every gesture that slowly erased me, I made a decision. One of those decisions that isn't born of impulse, but of an internal maturation that takes time to develop. I didn't say anything immediately. I observed. I waited. I wanted to be sure my choice wasn't born of anger, but of peace. Because, for the first time, I didn't just want to leave that house. I wanted to enter a new cycle. A cycle where I could finally recognize myself again. I began looking for a place of my own. Something simple, modest, but with the essential, my autonomy. A space where I could decide whether I wanted silence or music, whether the coffee would be strong or mild, whether I would wake up at 6 in the morning or noon. Small freedoms that, when lost, take a while to be felt, but which, when regained, have a taste of a new beginning indescribable. And it was with this spirit of rebuilding that I found a small apartment on the ground floor, with large windows and light streaming in all day long. Exactly the opposite of the darkness I'd lived in for the past few years. The day I moved in wasn't marked by tears or emotional goodbyes. It was discreet. Samantha didn't even show up. Brian helped me with the boxes, in awkward silence, and said he'd visit soon. I smiled, thanked him, and left the door open, literally and symbolically. Because despite everything, he was still my son. But this time, what was open was a space of truth, not submission. If he wanted to enter, he would have to come with respect, with awareness, with truth. Settling into that new home was like dusting off a part of my soul. Cooking just for myself, without fear of judgmental looks. Reading my books on the porch, without having to pretend to be busy. Calling friends and laughing out loud, without feeling like I was bothering them. It was in this simple environment that I rediscovered my identity. And I realized it wasn't too late to rebuild. It was, in fact, just the right time. The neighborhood welcomed me with a kindness I hadn't even realized existed. A lady upstairs brought me cookies on my first day. A couple next door offered to help me with the internet. Small, simple, and kind gestures, but they have the power to restore faith in human interaction. And it was in this setting, amidst plants in the window and the smell of baking bread, that I wrote my first letter to myself at my new address. It began, "Dear Beatrice, welcome back." The psychologist I was seeing told me this phase is called reintegration. It's when you come back to yourself. When, after an intense journey of emotional survival, you find shelter within your own skin. And I understood, with the depth of someone who's lived it, that it's not age that defines our strength. It's what we choose to accept. It's the limit we impose with love, the voice we find amidst the noise. And, more than anything, it's the silence we learn to cultivate, not the kind that suffocates, but the kind that protects. I started sewing more often again. Not to sell, nor to please anyone, but because it's there between threads and fabrics, that my soul breathes. Each stitch is a conversation with myself. Each finished piece is a small victory over the time they tried to steal from me. One day, I sewed a floral dress and put it on just for myself. I looked in the mirror and, for the first time in years, I felt truly beautiful. Not young. Beautiful. With the beauty that comes from knowing who they are. Brian gradually began visiting me, always with some insignificant gift, as if using objects to make up for the past. I welcomed him warmly, but without giving way to the old dynamic. He noticed. One day he sat on the couch, looked at me with moist eyes, and said, "Mom, you're stronger than any of us." I just smiled. Because that sentence, at that moment, needed no response. It was the echo of everything I had already experienced. Samantha never crossed my path again. And this, curiously, also became a form of peace. Because there are bonds that, when broken, liberate. And my story with her was just that. A hard but necessary passage that brought me back to myself. And it showed me, with all possible clarity, that respect isn't demanded. It's imposed with presence, with firmness, with choices. Today, when I walk the streets and someone looks at me like, just another lady, I smile inside. Because I know I carry a whole story behind my eyes. A story of silent overcoming, of slow transformation, of strength that doesn't make a fuss. And if there's one thing I want to leave as a legacy, more than sewn clothes, more than family recipes, it's this. The awareness that no one should accept being erased. That living with dignity is a decision. And that respecting those who have lived for you should be the bare minimum. If you've stayed with me this far, it's because some part of this story resonated with you. And if it did, then it was worth sharing it all with you. Stories like mine, and maybe yours, aren't just meant to move us. They're meant to remind us of what truly matters. Of the value that no one can take away. If this video made you reflect, take a deep breath with me and write in the comments, "That message was for me." So I know I'm not alone in this conversation. If you want to continue walking together, subscribe to the channel. Here you'll always find stories of strength, new beginnings, and truths that need to be told. And if this video resonated with you, leave a like. It's not about numbers, it's about connection. It's the simplest way to say, I saw it. I felt it. I'm here. There's a video here on the side that complements this subject. Click and continue with me there. The next story will also move you.